For trainers, collectives, and individuals that were looking for a program to follow that was chud free, or perhaps one that came directly from us, there is Liberation Martial Arts Online. Thanks to Zara Groover, Nigel Kalamazoo, Deadaz, and Daniel Ponto for signing up. You can sign up for Liberation Martial Arts Online on Patreon and Substack. This will also give you access to uncut versions of our shows without any breaks or interruptions. Plus early access to our bonus shows, Fighter's Brew, which is a recap show of the manga All-Rounder Meguru, and SDS9, which recaps Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This is Sam.
This is Jason.
And this is Fight Study.
This episode was sponsored by SH, Alejandro, Ronde J, Berkshire People's Gym, and New Guy. Become a sponsor and not only get a mention on every episode, but also a monthly training session with me. Sign up on Patreon. On this Fight Study, Coach Jason and I are back to discuss UFC 291 and Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. But before we get into the fights, we wanted to take a moment to talk about Karl Richardson, our number one fan, and probably our first fan. He's why there still is a Fight Study, as he brought Coach Jason and me together. In the early days of the pod, I'd send Jason some of the praise Karl would give the show as encouragement that there are people loving what we're putting out there. He was always first to listen and first to give feedback. Since I've been creating content online, there's always been Karl. He started out as an avid reader of my blogs, and then eventually we became friends. This journey has spanned over a decade. What brought us together wasn't just a love for martial arts. I was also writing a lot about existing with the specter of cancer. Like dominoes, I lost a sister to cancer, my father, my mother, and even my dog. The entire time I've known Karl, he had cancer. Even before Southpaw or Fight Study, he was always my first listener and reader, and the first to give me feedback and topic ideas. His constant encouragement is why I stuck with Southpaw for as long as I have. He constantly let me know I was putting good stuff out there in the world. And as a big-time Bruce Lee fan, he told me he was glad to have been alive for one more person with radical and political ideas about martial arts emerge. I didn't know if what I was doing was that important, but it was good to know that at least one person thought it was. I talked to Karl a day before he passed. I knew he was going into hospice, but he still talked to me about my latest content because he still wanted to have interests outside of cancer and be Karl, not Karl with cancer. Even with death looming, he was still upbeat, funny, and thankful for the time he had here with us, even though he knew it would be cut short. I've never known him to carry any resentment, only dignity. When I think of Karl, I think of how he always carried himself with such dignity. No matter how much pain he was in, he had grace for those around him. He always responded. He always replied. He always reached out. In one of our last texts, he said he was hoping for a miracle from God. But if God says no, then so long and thanks for all the fish. Peace out. That's Karl.
Oh, first, that was beautiful. And I'm sorry for your loss, given that you've known him for as long as you have. I haven't known him as long, and you and I have been doing this, going on 2 years now?
Yeah.
But I can tell you this. I can tell you how Karl made me proud of one of my, my rants. I think that one about currying favor with the almighty oppressors. I think he said it should be on every UFC fighter locker room. Or I could tell you how he turned me on to the movie Whiplash, which is one of my top 5 favorite movies of all time. And it changed my entire coaching philosophy and had me examine myself, take a more introspective look on who I am and how toxic I can be at times when I become too competitive or driven by my own insecurities or shortcomings. But But beyond that, it was a random tweet of his that I think had the most profound effect on me. Karl once responded to a post on Twitter, and it was a well thought out post from a guy named Lex Lutheran that asked why individuals who were nerdy when they were younger but went on to lead very successful lives, what Lex referred to as the blessed path, but they tended to push their children in the way of the cool kids. And yeah, that's a generalization, sure. But after 47 years on this planet, I've seen it happen plenty of times. Anyway, it's what Karl said in his response, and that was almost 1 year ago to the day. It's August 6, 2022. And it always stuck with me. Karl's response to that was that he wrote, "It shows how deep wounds from adolescence can actually go. All the success, and they still want to undo being outcast in one's formative years. So now they do what they can to ensure that it doesn't happen to their kids, all while ignoring the benefits they had as a result of avoiding the in crowd." And I must have used the phrase wounds of adolescence 100 times since then. Whether it's talking about my own past, something I continue to struggle with, or whether talking about nearly every fighter I've ever worked with. The wounds of adolescence are very real and they cut deeply. But I think it's what you said. Karl had a connection to humanity that was a constant in all of his philosophies, his fighting, his training, his religious, and just general philosophies as a human being. So my response to Karl when he wrote that was, yeah. Sorry. It was simply this. I have no problem referring to you as friend or brother. You get it. You have an understanding on a molecular level. I want you to know that it's valuable and appreciated. And that's Twitter. And you know how I feel about that space. Right?
Yeah.
So very seldom does someone elicit that response from me. But I imagine he had that sort of impact on many. And in a day and age when it's become fashionable to lose our humanity, just like you said, he carries it with him with an ease and a dignity that made me wonder where I'd misplaced my own. And it reminded me that we can all stand to afford one another just a little bit more grace, and how much of a difference that little bit of grace can really make. So thank you, and I thank Karl for letting me remember the difference a little bit of grace can make.
Yeah. I think he was always thoughtful with every interaction and brought grace to everybody he interacted with. That's Karl.
In on a medium such as Twitter, in fight space, in political culture, he never let it make him biting or caustic or
cynical.
He didn't have that ability, and I am born of that. So to see it and be reminded of it and have someone like something that I wrote or something that I said, it lets you know that a lot of good can come from some of these small things and these interactions that we think are trivial. I think it was Brandon Lee in The Crow who said, "Nothing is trivial. Nothing."
He was definitely one of the good ones. And for those who follow us on social media who might be confused, Karl is the second person we lost this week from the Southpaw community. That's just how it works sometimes. But it also means I personally have known a lot of people and got to share time and kinship with them. And that's worth all the sorrow. Community means both ups and downs. but going through it together makes it much easier. Love you and miss you, Karl. I hope you train with Bruce and find a decent burger joint on the other side. Tell Bruce I said he was right about putting your dominant hand in the lead, which fits perfectly into today's episode and our discussion of Terence Crawford. Karl and I always talked about doing an episode together, but he was never in good enough health. So, Karl, this episode is for you. So, let's get into the fights. And we have to talk about Crawford versus Spence first, because that's the biggest and most important fight over this weekend. Spence was the unified champion, and Crawford was the WBO champion. This was also a fight between the upper echelon of boxing's pound for pound, with the winner possibly staking their claim to being number one. And that ended up being Terence Crawford by 9th round TKO, and he made it look easy. People were split on who'd win, with both sides saying it would be close, but it was not close. Naoya Inoue beat Stephen Fulton in devastating fashion this week, and though Fulton is very good, he's not a pound for pound. It's not just that Crawford won, but how he won and who he beat. Crawford is now 40-0 with 31 finishes, and his last 11 in a row have been finishes. Usually fighters have all their finishes early on and then get decisions as they face the top of the top, but not Crawford. It was not only a historic fight, but a historic performance, one where we might say, hey, we were around for this guy. Jason, can you talk to us about this fight?
Absolutely. And this was honestly the most anticipated fight for me as both a coach and a boxing fan. I've always been a huge Bud Crawford fan. I don't even remember where it was hell, it had to be pre-2010. I remember him wearing a red Nebraska Cornhuskers hat. And I remember the commentators talking about how good of a wrestler he was in high school. And you know my wrestling bias. So I just started watching him, and you could tell. And even if you don't know anything about boxing, it's not hard to see that Bud Crawford is a generational talent. If you think about just who he's beaten, Kell Brook, Sean Porter, Amir Khan, Jeff Horn, Crawford's TKO'd all of those fighters I just mentioned, right? So you have to be pretty moved by his body of work whenever he's dispatching of a murderer's row like that, and his ability to make great fighters look rather pedestrian. And we'll talk at length about Errol Spence's jab, and I know how good Errol Spence is. I may have a reverse bias or maybe an animus because he's beaten the living shit out of a couple of my close friends. One is Sammy Vargas, who Sammy was 16-0 when they fought, and he TKO'd Sammy in the 4th round. Another close friend of mine from the Philly area was Ronald Cruz. Ronald was 13-0 and went the distance with Spence, but Ronald's nearly blind in one eye because of that jab that he put on him in a fight that should have been called well before the 10th. But again, you'll hear me say it, it's easy to be brave with another man's blood, and Ronald Cruz is one of the toughest and one of the best guys I know. Speaking of the jab, Spence has an outstanding one. It's a stiff jab, and he gets plenty of heat on it without losing quickness. He works up and down with it, so he'll touch it to the body. He's constant with it, and so he controls much of the fight with it. You know, whether he's touching to the head or body. If anyone is a fan or remotely knows boxing, it's pretty clear that Errol Spence is one of the best jabbers in the game. He'll jab high, then he'll come with a straight left, or he'll loop it a little bit around, and he'll take that same shot to the body. And then he'll shift off, and he'll hit a right hook to the body. So he's got plenty of tools, but he's masterful with the jab, which is probably the most important punch in boxing. I think it's the most important punch in boxing, but that debate's for another episode. So if you talk about more about the Spence and the success that he almost always has with his jab, he's outstanding at pressuring with it, and he builds off of it. But what Crawford did almost immediately was settle try to pick up the timing of that jab, and he started to split Spence's jab with his own jab. And if you're familiar with the 3 initiatives from Jack Slack, he'll call it a simultaneous counter. I used to call it a split punch series. When you're fighting someone in the same stance as you, your jab versus their jab, you little parry, head off line. And once Crawford took that jab away, which he did immediately, Crawford controlled the positioning game so well, proving to me, and I think to many others, that he's the more physical fighter. And even, this isn't going to make sense to most people, but even if Spence is arguably the bigger and stronger man. So the bumping and thumping that Spence typically gets away with on the inside, where he'll bump to create some space and he'll blast you off it, it wasn't there for him the same way when he was fighting Crawford, who is just as strong, I think, on the inside. But he still was smart enough to give some ground while having excellent foot and body position throughout the 9 rounds.
A note to our listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, like early releases of Southpaw Deep Space Nine, our fictional narrative podcast, Fighters Brew, break-free versions of our shows without interruptions like you're hearing now, bonus articles, Fighters Brew transcripts with extra content, Liberation Martial Arts Online, as well as our private chat group on Discord. You can also make one-time donations at Ko-Fi or show your solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com.
And even if Crawford was, and don't get me wrong, if Crawford was able to plant and be more physical and stand his ground and play on the inside with Spence, why the fuck would he? He's too smart for that, to stand in front of him and let Spence start breaking him down to the body like Spence does. So Crawford posting like he did in round 9 to set up that angle with that lateral footwork, put a desperate Spence in front of Crawford, but Crawford was not in front of Spence. He created that dominant angle, and he sealed the deal. And there's a million little things I could discuss, and I would love to sit down and do an episode a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, or even 5 years from now, where we break down round for round the intricacies and the beauty of really what he is doing in terms of punch selection. But one of the most obvious was, a straight left and then finishing with the lead hand. I mean, there's plenty of obvious ones. Uppercutting to the hook and hooking to set up the uppercut. And it was really a thing of beauty. And if you really know how good Errol Spence is, you now know how good Bud Crawford is.
Recently, I released an article called Picking a Fighting Stance, a Theory. And it goes into deep detail about the importance of the stance and what advantages one stance has over the other, and why your fighting stance is not a given, but something you should actually put thought and consideration into. Crawford is actually right-handed, but he mostly stands southpaw. Bruce Lee advocated for this, though Lee was more interested in reach, like fencing. Karl and I used to talk about that. But from the Liberation Martial Arts perspective, the advantage to putting your dominant side in the lead is better perception. Crawford's training partner, Shakur Stevenson, is also right-handed and also stands southpaw. So for most people, your dominant eye corresponds with your dominant hand. Most right-handed people mostly see with their right eye, not both. So by standing southpaw and putting your dominant eye in the lead, you see better. I wrote about Stevenson's vision and how he manages his opponent's perception with his lead hand, and this is part of why. What makes Crawford so good with the jab and the counter is that he has the best hand-eye coordination with his right hand, and since his right eye is in the lead, he can see openings and shots coming his way that much better. The advantage to putting your dominant hand in the rear is power. The advantage to putting your dominant side in the lead is vision. Now couple vision with an iron chin, cardio, grit, and power, and you have the monster called Bud Crawford. I watched the docuseries Quarterback, and they talked about something that you talk about, Jason, pocket presence, where the quarterback can see everything in the pocket, both threats and openings. That was Crawford. He saw everything, and Spence didn't. Even though they both fought southpaw, Spence, to me, has a stance and style that favors fighting orthodox fighters because he stood much more side-on than Crawford. This works well against orthodox fighters, but against another southpaw, Spence looked more twisted up and imbalanced. He constantly fell out of stance, lunged forward, and was off balance. Crawford looked sturdy, like he could squat, deadlift, defend, punch, throw a football, and move. Always in the same athletic stance, in what I call the J stance, even though he's the switch hitter. And in doing some research, Spence has had problems with southpaws in the past, and times when Sean Porter switched to southpaw, he gave Spence problems. I think Bud's team recognized Crawford being a southpaw was a bad style matchup for Spence, and so they stayed southpaw the whole time. And it was a bad style matchup, a very, very, very bad one. But think about this. The scariest fighter in combat sports has the nickname Bud, which I love about boxing because you'll have interesting nicknames like this because your nickname is the one other people chose for you. In MMA, you pick your own nickname, so everyone chooses nicknames like Alpha Edgelord.
Yeah, the douchier, the better.
Speaking of MMA, let's talk about UFC 291, starting with the main event, Dustin Poirier versus Justin Gaethje 2 for the BMF belt, which we all know they only brought that belt back to compete against any possible boxing event that was happening that night, but also because they have obligations to Disney where they have to have a certain number of title fights a year. I should also mention the hypocrisy of capitalist Democrats because this whole company isn't run by Dana White, but Ari Emanuel, who is a big DNC donor and brother to Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff. Ari is also Donald Trump's agent. He also runs the WWE, where wrestlers pretend to be enemies when they're all friends in the back. And that's how capitalism works. They're all in bed together. You got Disney pretending to be against the far right while courting Donald Trump on one of their platforms and moving to Florida. Yes, people who hate Republicans move to Florida. Okay. Leading up to this fight, the UFC did an official branded interview with Trump, with Matt Chud Serra as one of the interviewers. Both Emmanuel and Bob Iger of Disney come out saying they're for the Democrats while fighting any labor efforts, mistreating workers, and trying to avoid taxes and being in bed with conservatives. WME, the parent company, mostly tries to court conservative businesses and fans. WME came out with a statement that they support writers and actors for fair wages and control of their image and likeness while they completely fuck over their fighters, wrestlers, and workers. It's all pro wrestling, pretending to be political enemies when it's all one unified capitalist class in the back. But to quote Jason, I digress. Jason, for Poirier versus Gaethje, how was the fight going for both fighters until the finish?
Well, can I digress your digression real quick? Because,
yes.
I mean, I think you need Matt Serra to make Trump seem articulate, don't you? And I think maybe, just maybe, Sarah can do that. But I digress. Maybe that's a cheap shot, and I should apologize, but I won't. Anyway, to your question. I like the Gaethje shot he shot in the first with a pretty nice head kick. That came pretty close to landing. So it's clear to me that he saw something, or maybe I'm wrong and he was just working another tool into his arsenal. Even on the first head kick in the first round, Poirier did the old pull your shorts up thing that we'll discuss more later. But as soon as he did that, if I remember correctly, Gaethje was right back on him. And it's like, if that's where you want your hands, that's where I'll place my fucking foot. And eventually, like, the fight brain starts picking up those things, and you start to see openings. I don't think anyone's going to see them with like the supercomputer ability of against Errol Spence like Bud Crawford did. And that's it. Again, I could talk about that all day. But I think Gaethje started to see some openings, and his strike selection sort of mirrored with the opportunities that presented themselves. And he sort of goes on autopilot because he's a bit of a fighting machine. He doesn't know danger. He just sort of just wades in, and just if you give him an opening, he's going to take it. And I think earlier in his career, he was a little bit quicker to force things with just straight aggression. And now maybe he sees things. And when you throw the body and the brain into combat as many times as he's been in, you start to make some decisions. And I think his autopilot's a lot better than most. So Gaethje's always has excellent power. He's a hell of a puncher and excellent low kicks. So the occasional head kick is another weapon in a more diverse arsenal for his opponents to contend with. And I love seeing an older dog learn some new tricks. I think it's a pretty good thing, in my opinion.
What's interesting is the last time the UFC was in Salt Lake City, Leon Edwards beat Kamaru Usman, Gaethje's training partner, with the same kick. Also in the corner, they told Poirier to look for his own high kick because Gaethje kept ducking. And Poirier did land some mean kicks in round 1 because of that tendency. But so did Gaethje. He landed 2 solid high kicks in round 1 that you mentioned. And Poirier blocked them all with his version of the Philly shell, with one hand blocking the head, the other arm blocking the body. Jason, did we see the danger to this defense against kicks?
A bit, I think. Yeah. Especially when people start working multi-pronged attacks. Like we see kicking over your power hand. I think that's a great technique. Cerrone was great with it, and Whitaker was masterful at it. And so when people start to over parry, or again, these are smaller gloves, so you don't have the same surface area to defend. So unless you're hugging your forearm to your head, that shit's going to sneak through. And last I checked, most legs were bigger than most arms. So if your arm is hanging out in space, and even if you block it a bit and you have that hand up, it's going to kick through it or to it, and it's going to catch something on its way. And if it is kicking through it, then it touches the head or it touches the neck, you're going to drop like a fucking stone. So I just think that you're starting to see better fighting and better strike selection, and with smaller gloves, and a want to be more aggressive and more entertaining. I don't want to even call it a deficiency. It's just the more time you spend on offense, the less time you're spending on defense, so more opportunities will start to present themselves. So the beauty of, I think, Poirier and Gaethje is you get to see what happens when you actually combine skill with aggression. You get to see some really cool shit and some great fighting that will open itself up and lend itself to some spectacular finishes. This is another example of it. But you start needing some higher level technique and expanding your skill set. More dynamic attacks. Like I said before, more tools in your arsenal, greater things to contend with. There's more to contend with. You can create better opportunity. So I think that's what you're starting to see. And we can talk about the age of these guys, but I think there is some real value in continuing to mature and progress as a fighter. And if you have to be aggressive to be marketable, please bring the fucking skill with it. Because there's only so much of that contender level bullshit I can see in the big leagues. So what we're seeing is some, the sport's evolving, and I love that some of, I don't even want to call them the old guard because they're not even that old, but guys who have been, that Poirier and Gaethje, they're veterans. They got a lot of battles under their belt. They're tested, tried and true, but you're seeing a new wrinkle to the game added to it. And yeah, I think there are some limitations to more of a boxing centric defense. And I think opening up your arsenal a little bit and going outside of your low kicks, uppercut, hook combinations, is what we saw, and it really paid off for Gaethje. And I say that loving Poirier as a fighter and his body of work, and his tan looked fucking outstanding, didn't it?
It did.
He looked great.
You really saw how dark it was once he started pulling up his pants and you saw his tan line.
Right?
And I really want to talk about that because I noticed some things too, and I think we both noticed some of the same things. With Poirier messing with his shorts, it seemed like it's become a bit of a tell that Gaethje had a read on. Whenever Poirier messes with his shorts, it's out in distance. Then he'll skip forward, leading with his rear leg, which makes it hard to be precise with your steps. In round one, Gaethje seemed to try and jam him when he would do this by trying to catch him as he galloped forward, and that found success. But later, he switched it up where he would back up when Poirier played with his shorts, which made Poirier gallop and chase him. If you look at that final kick, Poirier is way closer to Gaethje than he was the previous 2 times that he was kicked. The earlier head kicks caught Poirier with the foot, whereas when Poirier was close, he was caught with the shin, which is why having one hand up wasn't good enough. Poirier was so close, he got punched by that throwaway right that was only supposed to be a feint for the high kick. Gaethje doesn't have long arms, and from Poirier's reaction, he had no idea he was within Gaethje's short punching range. It feels like Trevor Whitman broke down tape on Poirier, but this is the second time they fought, so they already knew a lot about Poirier. When everything you do is taped and studied, I think even seemingly benign, non-productive habits can become a liability. If you love the Southpaw Project, become one of our financial supporters. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. We can't exist without your contributions. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at southpawpod.com.
No, I agree 100%. And that's the thing. Once you've been at the highest level of this game, there's footage on you. And if you say to yourself, this is what I do, we do what we do, well, then they know what you do. And Whitman's an excellent coach. Gaethje's an excellent fighter. You start combining good fighters with good camps and great fighters with great coaches, then they can, if they can see behind the scenes or they have a read on your playbook, well, you better change the fucking plays every once in a while. Switch some things up. And so I'm not saying, because Poirier has had a ton of success doing what he does, but do I think you bring that same thing and not bring a little extra if you can? I mean, we saw which fighter brought a little something extra and a little something different and how it worked. If you fight someone the same time, same way, every time, if the first 10 plays you call in football and you're 10-0, I promise you the 11th time you try it, that motherfucker, the coach is going to have something for you. They're going to know. So diversity, setups, making some strategic adjustments, all very, very important. But I will say this, you know that if you can get Poirier to react by pulling up his shorts, you know that he is not punching and he is not defending. And we're not the only ones who see it, right? Those fighters see it. Their coaches see it. And if you can't fix that because it's a tick, well, you better be prepared for someone else to try to expose that. And if you don't do it, if you know either a heavy right-hand puncher and you're not shuffling away from their power side while you pull up your shorts, or I don't know what the plan is, but it's something that has been happening and that you see it. And it is It's the mark of a good coach to try to exploit any vulnerabilities. And I don't know if they game planned it that deeply, but I sure as fuck would have if I was fighting someone as good as Dustin Poirier.
You might game plan against it just out of spite because it annoys you so much.
It does. The only thing that annoyed me more was Clay Guida's fucking hair. Actually, no. Ben Henderson's hair and
Toothpick?
the toothpick and that fucking flick jab. I hated it. I just hated his little flick fake jab. Well, that and Frankie Edgar's movement, just all that bothered me. Even if it was just working perfectly, it all upset me.
Well, those are all just different versions of spam, right? You're just spamming shit that isn't important.
Yes. And they've got some, like Frankie Edgar had his durability, his cardio, and his wrestling, that once you started chasing him after all that spam, he'd score. Ben Henderson was just an incredibly physically gifted human being and an excellent, and he had some tools as a fighter that you couldn't teach. And Clay Guida, I mean, I talk about fighting with your hair on fire. It actually looked like his fucking hair was on fire. That's how he fought, and he looked like he was trying to shake out the
embers.
Right, yeah, it looked like he was trying to shake out the embers burning in his hair and his head, because his head was always moving, his hair was always shaking. But again, those are spammy techniques that if you're not doing it for a reason, the sport will catch up with you.
Yes.
And, for those guys, it started to. Doesn't mean it doesn't work. Doesn't mean it didn't work. Didn't mean it didn't help them settle in and maybe even win fights that they shouldn't have won. But I'm just saying, if you can predict behavior, and who is this? I don't know who said this. Is it Skinner? You give me a baby and I can make any man. Well, if behavior is predictable, it becomes controllable. And we all go MK Ultra on that motherfucker, right? We start, if it's predictable, it's controllable. So don't let it be so predictable. But I understand that a lot of fighters are rhythm fighters and they need to settle in.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But if you do that too much, then, you better have some shit with it. In a sport that becomes more and more about aggression, if you are predictable aggression, there's some good counterpunchers and some really, really good coaches who are good at teaching some good, solid counterpunching, and they'll wait and they'll fucking sleep you.
Now let's talk about Alex Pereira and his move up to light heavyweight to fight Jan Blachowicz. Jason, what did you think about this fight?
I think Pereira carries his hands like a fucking gunfighter at high noon in the Old West. Why are his hands so fucking low all the time, and yet it feels like he might shoot someone? And it's just as scary when he punches.
It does look threatening, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, even if you're the most capable boxer or mixed martial artist and you got hands for days, when someone comes at you like that with that sort of fuck you confidence, it makes you go, what's he got? Makes you just sort of think for a second. And that's how Alex Pereira fights. And I could never, I say this all the time, I would never teach anyone to do it, but wouldn't mind if a fighter had it, and he's got it, So it's hard to say. He looks really, really good at times in an otherwise boring fight. But I think that's what happens when you put 205ers at altitude and one of them's 40. So, but his takedown defense seems to be improving. He can weather a storm on the ground. I think he's just, I know Jan is just off the charts strong. And I think at 205, Alex is just as strong.
So you think this is the right weight for Pereira?
It is. And I was actually shocked to hear him say that he won if he does a trilogy fight with Izzy, that he wants it to be at 185, because that's where the first two took place. I was like, dude, why are you such a fucking badass? Like, is everything you do built from like that up? It seems like he doesn't even try. He thinks just as a matter of fair play. The first two are at 185. The third has to be done with some sort of weird Warriors code.
He has his own principles that he has to live by.
Yeah, and he doesn't seem to play, but by anyone else's set of principles, right? Or anyone else's set of rules. He sort of has that thing where he he puts on a bunch of weight, but and I think everyone in the world knows that a fight at 205 would benefit him and work to his advantage against Izzy. But he doesn't consider it for a second. In fact, with absolute immediacy, he responds, "No, like if we're going to do this, I think it needs to happen at 185." He's the one advocating for it. I'm like, Jesus, man, you hear people say it all the time, and it's cliche. Some people are just built differently. He's one of those ones that are built differently.
Jason, is Blachowicz striking underrated?
It is. It's stiff and it's straight, and he does that weird little run forward thing. But hey, like there's been a couple of world championship boxers who are doing the run and gun thing that it's fucking working for them. We saw it anyway. But MMA is a different sport. You deal with someone who's real physically strong and has sort of that I don't know, call it bone density and stiffness. And when you watch him turn over short little straight shots when he's hitting pads, I think you understand that the way Blachowicz fights works for him. You know, Jan's striking works for him. I don't think he has the quickness or agility or natural reflexes to be smoothed out into a great boxer. But I think if you get him gunning forward a little bit, when you get tangled up, he's going to knee you in the body, or he's going to fall on you and wrestle you, and he's just going to be this big, heavy lunk of a man who's just going to wear you down. And if he makes it ugly, he make it ugly. And if you separate from him and he touches you with those big tiger paws, he's going to fucking put you down.
Blachowicz to me is someone who doesn't have the best mechanics, but has really good game sense. This is why he can land awkward strikes, because he has the sense to recognize there's an opening despite not always being in the best position, which is why it looks awkward. It was the right shot, but you weren't necessarily in the best place to deliver it. A little bit like Yuri Prohaska.
The continuation of offense. Both Yuri and Jan have a continuation of offense. And I think Yuri's is a little wilder and a bit prettier. Actually, a lot prettier. But Jan's is a little more dialed in, and he can find those knees that seem to hurt people's bodies or quads when he gets tangled up in sort of that muddy area where it's a little bit harder to find clean stuff. And I think because he is sort of like that cast iron Eastern European body style where he's just fucking thumping you with like heavy bones. Typical, like all the thudding shots you see from the Russian fighters, bop, bop, bop. They're just sort of thumping you. Even when it's hitting them in the shoulders, you just hear it and sort of feel it. When Blachowicz throws an overhand right and hits you with like the meaty part of his forearm, you still see guys go flying back into the cage. And you're like, well, technically they fucking blocked that. And they're still being moved by a very physically powerful human. So like those are physical advantages that if you can build a skill set around, by all means. And I think that's what you see with his style. And again, he's 40 years old. Strength and power tend to stick around a little bit longer. I guess until you turn 47 and get COVID a second fucking time, and then it leaves you. I digress. But yeah, so those things seem to stick around a little bit longer, and he's fighting to those, no pun intended, to those strengths. So, and once you hit 47, once you hit your 40s, you sort of have solidarity with the older fighters, and you want them to do well. You want them to stick around. You want them to pull off the miracle submission or the miracle knockout, because somehow in your head, you're like, maybe I still got it too. So we can all live those lives of self-deceit and, make it a little more entertaining from one day to the next. But it's nice when you see some of those older guys give us a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
I just think Paheo was a little bit too tall of a task at elevation. And it was also a good showing from Alex against a former world champion and someone who's beaten Izzy.
Jason, is Pereira awkward too, or does he have good mechanics that beginner fighters should emulate?
No one should emulate Alex Pereira, except maybe his like inside leg kick and his no-show outside kick and calf kick. But he does that with his hands, again, seemingly at his belt line. And you shouldn't fight like that.
Especially with the small gloves.
Yeah, not at all. But he can. And again, it works for him. And if you have cinder blocks for hands and you got a lunchbox size head and you can eat those shots at 205 against Blachowicz, then hey, by all means, would I teach that as a first line of defense or a tier 1 tactic? No, I would try to layer it a little more. But hey, smoke him if you got him, and fuck if he doesn't got him.
Yeah, to your point, his chin looked a lot sturdier at 205 because he's probably just much more hydrated.
Yeah, no doubt. I think he came in at plus 225. And I talk about some people fighting to their strengths because they may not necessarily have the same kind of physical ability. I think for a large man, Alex is incredibly coordinated. He is quick. He is very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? He's got that sort of hip dexterity that you want in someone who's going to punch and kick. But I just think he's comfortable going in like an absolute fucking warrior and thinking he can get greater torque on some of his shots if his hands are low. And he's fine fighting that way.
Well, that's it for this fight study. What a weekend of fights. I'm really enjoying these stellar fights boxing is putting on lately and all the fighters coming up right now. If you're a fan of combat sports, don't just stick with the UFC. There's some great boxing out there. Also some great kickboxing and Muay Thai. One Championship puts on a lot of free cards straight onto YouTube, especially stadium shows. And they also have cards on Amazon Prime. YouTube and Instagram also have tons of grappling matches. By watching a deeper breadth of martial arts, you'll actually get a better game sense for MMA. With all that said, thank you, Jason, for your wisdom as always. Thank you all for listening to Fight Study. Hope you enjoyed this one, Karl.
Hope you enjoyed this one too, Karl.
If you like this episode and like what we do, support us on Patreon or Substack. We also have the Liberation Martial Arts program if you want to train with us from wherever you are. You'll find lots of techniques, exercises, theory, pedagogy, and even political theory. You can even get a monthly training session with me, either in person or online, depending on your location. We also have Fighter's Brew, which is a manga-inspired martial arts audio series, as well as Fighter's Brew transcripts that include martial arts tutorials. You can find Liberation Martial Arts online, along with Fighter's Brew, on Patreon and Substack. You can find Southpaw merch at our store. You can find all our links at southpawpod.com.